Welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. In the last podcast, we talked a little bit about John Beebe's 8-function model and a little bit about shadow functions, which are the 4 functions that are not in your, what's technically called your cognitive function stack, or what we refer to as the CAR model of your personality type. And we get some questions, or we frequently get questions around, why we focus on the 4-function, stack, or that 4-function model as opposed to all 8 functions. And there's a couple different reasons we mentioned in the last podcast that we feel there's a lot of work to do for most people in their CAR model, and so we don't want to do a ton of misdirecting or redirecting attention away from that growth process. But I think it's also because there is a phenomena that happens in relationship to each personality type and their CAR model, or those 4 functions, that you don't see in the shadow processes. And that is the word compulsion. We feel compelled to use our functions that are in our CAR model. There's a relationship we have with those functions that makes it so that we can't fully get away from their influence. And we wouldn't want to, honestly. They're basically what makes up our personality type. The compulsion comes from those functions being either our dominant and auxiliary, or we call our driver and co-pilot, and they're strong. They're the strengths we bring to the world, and they're our primary lenses through which we see reality. And then the tertiary and inferior, or the 10-year-old and 3-year-old functions, are intrinsically linked to the driver and the co-pilot because they create a polarity. The polarity of the dominant and inferior, or driver and 3-year-old, those functions are intrinsically linked together, and so they don't exist without the other. And the same thing, of course, would apply to the co-pilot and 10-year-old, or what's technically called the auxiliary and tertiary. And so we feel a compulsion to use these functions, and so they have a special influence on us. And we want to talk a little bit about the relationship that we as individuals have with functions depending upon where they fall in our stack. And then on top of that, we want to go into a little bit into how the functions show up as inferior for us. Like, if we feel a compulsion to use them, how are they influencing us? What are some of the ways that we experience them? And then talk a little bit about each of the functions in that position. And then, of course, from there, you can fillet out a pattern of then how it would be used as a tertiary 10-year-old, co-pilot auxiliary, and driver dominant. So one thing we've noticed is that the further up a function is in your stack, so we're talking about the 4 functions in your 4-function stack, the further up it is, the more of an intrinsic reward you get for using it. And so because you get intrinsic reward, or a little hit of reward when you use these functions, of course, you are going to spend more time, you, me, all of us, are going to spend more time using those functions because they come with rewards. They light up our reward centers. They come with positive things. And so because of that, because of the amount of time we spend using those functions, then we get a sophistication with them. We take in more territory when we're using them. Just like when you pick up any skill, the more you use it, the more principles you understand around it, the more you understand things like what rules you can and cannot break, right? And you understand a little bit more about how it relates to other things that seemingly don't have a relationship with it. The more you use something, the more you build a skill, the more you go, oh, this actually has a relationship to other things as well. And you can bring some of those principles in. And so your territory expands in the use of those tools. And that's what happens when our functions are higher up in our stack. The higher it up it is, the more territory we take in for understanding things like what rules can be broken, what rules can't be broken, the relationship it has with other things, and an increased ability to know which context this is the right tool to use this job. So another thing that comes along with functions that are higher up in our stack, or the things that grow as a function is more accessible to us, is discretion. We learn when the context, or we learn how the context applies to the function. Discretion is basically knowing how to apportion something and how much to apportion of something, when and how much. And when we're using a function well, we understand how much of the thing that is represented within that function should be apportioned in any specific context. Okay, that's super abstract. So let's bring it down for us.
Yeah, I have an example of this from a very specific example. We had an ISTP friend probably 10 years ago who every time we'd hang out with him, he would brag about how people were attracted to him, and he would have these bragging things about his social relationships and his girlfriends he had, and how just he was this awesome guy and everybody was super attracted and all this stuff. And it was turning us off a little bit. We're like, whoa, dude, like you don't have to brag so much. And we talked a little about it offline. We realized it was an attempt for him as an ISTP, his inferior process of extroverted feeling or harmony was attempting to make a connection with us. And so he was sharing some of his experience in his mind and his self. I don't think he thought he was bragging about things. He was trying to share some of the experiences of things that made him excited and lit him up. But the way it came off to us was almost like he was bragging about his abilities or his abilities or his attraction he was getting from other people. And it's weird because I don't think he was aware of how it was landing with his audience. But it was genuinely an attempt to say, here's the social value I bring. This is what I do, right? I talk about how people are attracted to me. That's the social value I bring to the table, right? And I think as reflecting back on that, that's kind of that idea where the discretion wasn't really aware to him. And I've seen this on social media too. Maybe somebody like it's an ITP is in a relationship with somebody and they're like broadcasting the intimate details of how they feel in some of the intimate moments. And I'm always like, does the other person know you're sharing this right now? And it's that extroverted feeling. This is just from an ITP standpoint. I'm picking on you right now, you ITPs. And I'm not saying all of you do this. I'm just saying that this is something that I've noticed sometimes. It's almost like you feel so strongly about it. You're excited to share. It's not really information. It's the connection. It's the feelings you have in the moment. You want to share externally. You want to share it with a larger group. And an ITP, INTP or ISTP with that harmony inferior 3-year-old doesn't have the discretion to know which context it's appropriate. All contexts are open to share this in. And so I think that's an example, I think, of what you're talking about with the discretion on a very low level, not knowing one or the other.
Yeah, I think that's what the kids call value signaling, right?
Maybe, yeah.
I think that's what that means. And I don't think you're picking on ITPs because we're actually going to go through all the functions.
Sure.
And pick on them all. And why not start with those who use extroverted feeling or harmony as their inferior 3-year-old? So as an example of how this looks, like you mentioned, is that there's this lack of discretion is this sense of not knowing how much and when. And so broadcasting things that signal high value in an attempt to create connection, that's a lack of discretion of knowing what pieces of information are actually going to create that connection. It's a lack of discretion of knowing how things land with people emotionally in order to continue that vibe, that connective vibe. And then when you're talking about broadcasting elements of a relationship on social media, this is a lack of understanding or awareness of just what creates connection. Is revealing parts of the things that you're very happy about or maybe really upset about or pissed off about. Is broadcasting that actually creating connections with with the rest of the people on the planet if it is effectively a message in a bottle, which social media posts always are. Their message is in a bottle, and you might have collected a lot of attention from people in the social media sphere, and so more of your bottles get grabbed out of the water, but they're still not really connective messages when you're revealing everything. And so, yeah, there's a lack of discretion of knowing what exactly creates connection. Whereas those same people in a party scenario might not say anything to anybody because they're not sure what to say in order to create connection. And so where they might overshare in a digital format, they're undersharing in an actual meet space environment. And so there's like an inability to know exactly how much and when. Right, which is why I keep using that word discrete.
Or what to share, quite frankly. I mean, again, picking on ITPs, sharing data in a social setting at a party typically doesn't go over well because people want to vibe, right? They just want to, it really doesn't matter what you say. They want to feel the energy and the connection with you. And sometimes I've seen TI primaries, introverted thinking or accuracy primaries, sharing a lot of content because that's their superpower, having a lot of content, a lot of thought. And in that environment, that context, they don't realize that's not going to work as well as maybe a classroom setting or maybe even just a one-on-one conversation in a daytime setting or a non-party setting, right? So it's like the knowing what to do as well as how much to do, I think, is the key.
Yeah, and the territory is small. The ability to create energetic vibe with another person, they might be able to do it with people who they know share their specific values and interests, but they might not have the acumen or the territory expansion to be able to continue a vibe going with somebody that doesn't, track with them on their interests, where they can't, quote the same movies together or whatever in order to create humor. And so they might have the ability to keep energetic vibe going, but only with a certain slice of kind of person. And so their territory is small, and then they don't know which rules can be broken, right? Like, again, the better you get at something, the more you know which rules have to be followed and which rules can be broken, which is why the value signaling piece or the bragging element, it breaks a rule that shouldn't be broken. And people with extroverted feeling or harmony higher up in their stack know that. They know bragging is a social faux pas, and so they don't do it. But when it's something that's your inferior or 3-year-old, you don't know that that's a rule that you pretty much have to observe all the time. Or when you brag, you have to do it in a certain way. Like there's a way of going about bragging that we have, in an unspoken social contract way, we've gone, well, that's the acceptable form of bragging.
Yeah, I've seen people do bragging well. Like the other day, I saw somebody post something about how they had just gotten like 1,000 Twitter followers, for example, and they did it in a way that was highlighting that, but almost like they were feigning shock or like, oh, how did this happen? And it was almost like they were asking a question of like something to the crowd, right? The followers, like, how did I get here? But obviously, it was a way for them to highlight that they had gained 1,000 followers on Twitter. So I think there's, like you're saying, there's mechanisms to do that. Again, I don't think we're not trying to talk about the specifics of this, like how you brag or how you share information. These are illustrative of how these things show up for us as our type and our cognitive functions, right?
Yeah. That said, as somebody who uses extroverted feeling or harmony as my 10-year-old or tertiary, I have a little bit more acumen here in knowing that bragging isn't acceptable, but the way that I've done it is I just say that first. I just go, hey, I totally know it's not cool for me to brag, and then I brag. Yeah.
As you were talking, I was thinking about how every time I post on social media, I like my own posts. I immediately like it. Like I heart, a post or I like it. And you've told me and other people have told me like a long time ago, like this is breaking a social like rule convention. And I'm like, yeah, I know that. And I don't care. And people are like, but it looks desperate. I'm like, yeah, I don't care about that either. But why would I not like my own stuff? And it's really interesting that people that like, for example, that use extroverted feeling maybe higher up on their stack, primary or secondary, driver or co-pilot, I think it really bothers them that I do that. Like not to the degree where they unfriend me or something or like even say something about it. But if there's a context to say something about it, many have spoken up that, yeah, it's not real cool, kind of rubs me the wrong way, but I kind of know you, so I let it go. But I bet if they didn't know me very well, it'd be like, what is this guy all about? Like liking his own post. Blah, blah, blah. Like it's like you just don't do that, right?
Well, and to piggyback off of that and our conversation in the last podcast around how when people are using your same functions but in the opposite attitude, it feels like they're using them wrong.
Yeah.
While there's a compulsion to use our function in the 4-function stack in some ways and at times, which is why I think John Beebe talks about things like opposing personality and that sort of thing, is that there's almost a compulsion to go against it in some ways.
That's for me.
Yeah. So
the social rules, I'm just like, I want to plow right through those.
Yeah, we end up being very sabotagey of those things. And so when people go, hey, you're not supposed to do that, and you go, yeah, I don't care.
It makes me want to do it even more. Don't tell me that. Now I'll just want to do it twice.
Exactly. Right. So I think that's an interesting phenomena, right? Is the idea that even as an inferior function, a person wants to obey those rules. They have a compulsion to obey them, but they don't necessarily know how to do that, right? There's a lack of discretion on exactly how to go about it. So they might be clumsy, but they're still compelled. And I think that's the important thing. I was going to say, you keep saying, let's not pick on ITPs, but let's start picking on other people, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's pick on the EFJs on the other side of the polarity. So EFJs, ENFJs, and ESFJs are using introverted thinking or accuracy as their inferior 3-year-old. And the way that it shows up as a lack of discretion is still a compulsion, And this is why every time I think of EFJ's compulsion to speak truth, I always imagine them snapping and moving their head from side to side and being like, I just tell it how it is. That's like my ultimate picture in my head of an EFJ calling upon and attempting to integrate the compelling nature of introverted thinking or accuracy's truth-telling.
They're all Valley girls in your mind?
Oh, Valley girls aren't like that. No, this is more like the I want to speak to your manager, mom haircut sort of truth-telling style.
Oh.
You know what I'm talking about?
I don't usually get along with those kind of people.
Yeah, I know. Well, and that's not to say that the EFJs are all like that by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I understand.
Yeah, but there's a truth to some of those stereotypes. And one of them is that they have to tell it like it is. The challenge, of course, is that with introverted thinking as your inferior, or accuracy as your inferior 3-year-old, is that there can be a lack of territory and a lack of discretion, meaning that you might not have all the information you needed in order to start truth-telling. Like, you might not be careful with maybe the source of the information. Maybe there's pieces of information that were just as relevant to whatever you think you need to be talking about, but you don't have all the facts. And so then you feel compelled to start talking about things that you only have half information on. So that's a piece of, not having the territory necessarily that you need in order to subsidize that truth-telling. The other piece of it is you don't know which rules you can break and which ones you can't, and you don't necessarily have a form of discretion around it, meaning that you might be in a vibe with somebody else, and they're telling you personal details about their life. And while you were vibing with them, you were totally supportive of them telling you these stories or these elements, these data points of their life that are very personal and very private to them. And then when this person gets into a vibe with yet another person, a third party, then sometimes they bring those pieces of information that they got from this other individual into that vibe, right? They're maintaining that extroverted feeling or harmony connection with this person. And now they're bringing in pieces of content, pieces of data that isn't that other person's business, right? It's not their business at all to say all of those pieces of information. And yet there's a lack of discretion in knowing that data isn't meant to be shared with everyone. That was a piece of information that they should have been holding with more protection than they are. And so oversharing information, oversharing pieces of information that are not theirs to share, sharing pieces of information that aren't the complete picture. These can all be ways that introverted thinking or accuracy function shows up as an inferior 3-year-old.
So again, we're not necessarily just talking about how these show up as inferiors. I just want to remind us, we're focused, not remind you, but remind us, all of us, you listening too, that we're talking about the compulsions of the 4 cognitive functions that are in your car model or stack, and how they show up a little different. Like, the compulsion is there, but what territory does it take in where it is in the stack? And we've focused in on the inferior 3-year-old, but these are going to have different levels of involvement, I guess, or compulsion showing up for us, depending on if they're the driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, or 3-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, because if you take introverted thinking or accuracy as a 10-year-old or tertiary, it takes in a little bit more territory. And also, it might show up as a lack of the inability to have discretion around it might show up as withholding, like withholding information that the person has a right to know, and not knowing how to go about saying it. And that's part of how it can show up as the inferior as well, is giving information out that isn't the other person's right to have, but also withholding information that is their right because you're trying to avoid conflict. And so that's a way that it can show up in either of those positions. The higher introverted thinking goes up on the stack, the more it knows how to protect information or to how to handle information with responsibility. Now, it might still, compromise itself because of its lack of awareness around its context. Like we were talking about having extroverted feeling or harmony as an inferior 3-year-old or 10-year-old tertiary. So this question of what information to give and when and with whom can sometimes get sticky in all of that. But it's a little bit different of a phenomena when you shift the polarity around which one which aspect of that polarity the person is struggling with proficiency around. And it's because it shows up a little bit differently depending upon where, or these functions show up differently depending upon where they fall in the stack. So let's stick with the theme of judging functions and go to the next ones, right? Let's talk a little bit about extroverted thinking or effectiveness as a 3-year-old or inferior, just to illustrate that lack of territory and discretion while still having the compulsion. So IFPs, people who lead with introverted feeling or authenticity, have extroverted thinking or effectiveness as their 3-year-old or inferior function. The compulsion is to have impact in the outside world. That's the compulsion that comes along with extroverted thinking or effectiveness. And there's a compulsion to get things done or make things happen in the outside world. But there's oftentimes a lack of discretion around what things the person should be doing in order to move the needle. We heard a really interesting definition of the word sloth recently in association with the Enneagram system, because sloth is, for Enneagram 9s, their vice, I believe it is, their vice, right? Or their, I can't remember which one it is.
I don't remember the word, but yeah, it's the thing they deal with.
I really need to get my Enneagram shit together, by the way, because I just throw these words around. I know what the words are, but I don't always have a remembrance of the thing that it's supposed to be. Is this the passion? Is this the vice?
Well, it was in the context of Beatrice and Aranio teaching their way of the symbol that we went to.
Exactly.
And they gave us some clarity around what sloth actually meant.
Exactly.
Which is, people equate sloth with being lazy at Enneagram 9, but really what it is it's, you're actually can be very, not productive, but you can be very active and do a lot of things, but it's not doing the right thing. And that's really what sloth is. It's pulling back from the right thing.
Yeah, it's not doing the right things. Exactly. It's doing, I think he defined it, Aranio defined it as doing everything but the right thing.
Yeah.
And so when somebody has extroverted thinking or effectiveness as their 3-year-old or inferior, that's oftentimes that lack of discretion. It's not knowing which is the thing that they should be doing. It's also lacking territory of just how big the system needs to be in order to make things happen. There's this sense that I alone can make it all happen. Like I alone can be the person that moves the needle, not recognizing that there always has to be cooperation with a team, particularly the bigger something, the bigger the dream, the bigger the team that has to be there to support it. So when somebody has this function as their inferior 3-year-old, the lack of territory is just how much system needs to be built. Everything looks easier, right, than it actually is. There's an undervaluing of how much goes into making something happen. There's an undervaluing of how much system needs to be set up and how much hard work needs to be done. And there's also a sense that they alone can do it. And there's not knowing which thing to do in order to make the thing happen. So there can be lots and lots and lots of activity, but a lot of it is spinning its wheels to not actually move the needle in the way that they, it's like I'm doing all this stuff. Why am I not getting any traction? So oftentimes this shows up as a lack of traction. And I think this can be mirrored in the experience of having it as a 10-year-old or tertiary. I mean, you could probably speak to your experience of like you have a little bit more sophistication than that, but you still struggle at times with having extroverted thinking or effectiveness as your 10-year-old.
I've seen it show up as overdoing it for a lot of 10-year-old or tertiary extroverted thinking, where you build too much. You know there needs to be a system. You have enough awareness to read it, but to write it, you tend to overbuild the system or over-systematize when it really does need more human components or more flexibility. There can be a rigidity and also an overbuilding. I think that's usually where it shows up for the 10-year-old.
And also probably biting off more than you can chew.
Of course, that, yeah.
Yeah, there's like a lack of discretion usually. And that's something you don't see as much when that function is a driver or a co-pilot. Like, in fact, you'll see a lot of reticence, particularly when it's a co-pilot, to take on too much.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I'll talk to extroverted thinking, like, how do you solve all these problems? Look at all these problems that I have in the company, or these challenges. And they're like, well, why are they even a problem or a challenge? I'm like, but because they are. We said yes to all these things. They're like, well, start saying no to things before you take them on. Like, that's how you solve it. Don't have them. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. I don't have to have all these things. Like, you don't think about that, right, when it's lower down in your stack. But I think the boundary setting is much better for extroverted thinking at the primary or co-pilot.
Yeah, like taking in more territory with that function means also recognizing that you will overburden the system if you say yes to too many things, because now all of these systems are pulling on the resource, which you just don't have that much resource. So it's a more sophisticated experience with making things happen. And so again, there's a compulsion, and that's why you take on too much, right? You bite off more than you can chew because there's a compulsion to have impact and make it happen. And it comes in with lack of territory and lack of discretion. But the further up it moves in the stack, the more you have the territory and the discretion that comes along with the compulsion, which is why it ends up being a strength.
And then you look at, if you flip it, introverted feeling or authenticity in that 3-year-old position has its own compulsions. I think there's a compulsion for identity individuality here that shows up. And it's something that can trip up the ETJ because they're finding that identity, but they're trying to do it through external means, through their markers of success maybe or whatever. But it's still there. It's like driving them. And I think there's a little bit of, weirdly enough, there's also a little bit of a bragging element that comes here too. It's a little different though. It's more of an identity bragging than I'm cool in society bragging. It's like I'm a cool person. I'm a great person because fill in the blanks of whatever this is. I haven't really identified totally that bragging piece, but I sense that I have had ETJ friends that bragging shows up with.
I think it might be around value and worth.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, like the compulsion is the need to believe that one is valid and important, right? Like they're a valid person and they're a person of worth. And so the desire is to express that worth and value through accumulation of things or stuff you can point to.
Or people.
Right. But I think the compulsion is actually to self-express. The compulsion is to express who they are as a person. And like you mentioned, I think that's dead on, this idea of individuality and value and worth as an individual. But there's a lack of territory in the sense that they're not doing as much spelunking, inner world spelunking, in understanding and getting to know who they are. And so while there's that compulsion to express who they are and a compulsion to have value and worth, there's a lack of understanding what that value and worth really is. And knowing what's really truly important to them can sometimes trip them up because they're not doing as much of that spelunking. And knowing like how much of themselves should they put into this project. There's a lack of discretion sometimes in that an ETJ can sometimes put everything they are into a project and it goes off like a wet firecracker, or they'll put nothing of themselves into a project and then they'll end up being exploitative, or they'll end up, like maybe doing something that is ethically wrong because they didn't put enough of their personal values into the thing that they were building.
I think if you move into the 10-year-old or tertiary position for ITJs, you often see the introverted feeling authenticity show up as more of a role person merger where their identity becomes the role they're engaged with. I'm reading Bob Iger's new book about being the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. I can't remember the title of the book, but it's a really interesting book. On the heels of reading Disney War, they're really great back-to-back. I'm pretty sure he's an ITJ, probably an INTJ. Again, I don't know him. I'm just guessing. But the point is, I think I see him talk a lot about, who he is outside of being the CEO and his identity and this role he's taken on. And Catherine talked about this on our INTX program. She's also an INTJ, and she talked about this idea of role-person merger, where that FI, that introverted feeling authenticity, starts to become like you and your role start to merge, and then you don't, like if you don't have that role anymore, you don't know who you are. I think that's more likely to happen with FI or authenticity in the back seat at the 10-year-old or 3-year-old position than it does in the front seat of the car.
Well, I could see it being something that really shows up for somebody when it's their 10-year-old or tertiary, because they are doing more of that spelunking. They're doing more of asking questions of who am I and what means something to me, and then handing it over to the context around them. Whereas I think when it's an inferior or 3-year-old, in that position, there's less even asking, right? Because there's less time to ask if you're handing over more of your time to your dominant or driver function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness.
Which triggers to me the thought that when something is in our 3-year-old or inferior position, It's childlike. And children go through the world obviously. Like, in other words, they assume what they're seeing is what they're seeing. My children, they assume it's obvious this is what's going on. And I think our backseat functions work very similarly. It's almost like, well, obviously this is how it works. You don't almost question it. It's not something you struggle with it because you don't necessarily how to use it. You don't take a lot of territory in. But a lot of these are very black and white when they're in the backseat of our car, right? When they're lower down the stack in the 10-year-old tertiary or in the inferior 3-year-old, it's like, well, this is just obvious, right?
I think one thing we could do now is talk a little bit about those judging functions when they are higher up in the stack.
Yeah.
So we started with extroverted feeling and how extroverted feeling, when it's low on the stack or is in the backseat of the car model, it lacks discretion. It doesn't know what rules can or cannot be, obeyed or disobeyed rather, or broken. And it doesn't take as much territory in. But as that function goes up, again, compulsions, right? What is the compulsion? The compulsion is to connect with other people, to energetically connect with them and vibe with them, and to have an emotional interchange back and forth and be in simpatico. So you could call the compulsion to get needs met, but really need meeting for extroverted feeling or harmony is just to make sure that we're all available for connection. Because if a person is focused on them getting their needs met, then they're hyper-focused on the self because they have a need going unmet. They're under-resourced. And so they're not going to be able to gel or vibe with another person. They're not going to be able to get into simpatico with the group because they're going to be self-referenced to getting that need met.
So basically what I hear you saying is extroverted feeling, somebody that uses extroverted feeling looks around the room, quote unquote, the room, and sees people metaphorically looking down at their needs, like the things that are going on for them, and says, well, hey, if I can help these people get their needs met, they're going to look up. They're not going to be navel gazing. They're going to look up. They're going to connect with the group. We're going to have a great experience here. We're going to be connected. We're going to be vibing. We're going to have a great social interchange, a great connection between people, and share that vibe that we love so much. So the reason we're attuned to needs is to enable that to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And so the higher up the function goes in the stack, the more it understands the compulsion to energetically vibe, and the more it understands which rules can be broken or not broken in order to keep that vibe going. Like extroverted feeling or harmony knows that sometimes you don't have to have compelling content to keep a vibe going. It knows that sometimes it's okay to brag and sometimes it's not. It understands the moments in which a person needs to have a hearing ear and moments and just be listening, and it knows when the person needs you to carry the conversation and do more of the talking.
Context.
Yes.
It gets this idea of context, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the higher up in the stack it goes, the more sophisticated it becomes with context and that emotional vibe. And getting needs met is one of the ways that it does it. So having that function high up in the stack means it's taking in more territory of people as well, right? Who's vibing with who? How many people are vibing? The more territory you take in, the more you understand vibe as a network, right? It's a network of nodes of people who are vibing with each other. It understands which rules can be broken and not broken. It has discretion on when it should remove the power of the connection and when it should be giving the power of the connection. If a person is crying, they don't want a circle of people around them going, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Extroverted feeling or harmony knows in that moment, you need just one person to take that person aside and listen, right? It understands how much connection is required in a moment to truly help a person get out of navel gazing, like you mentioned. And so it's a beautiful thing the higher up it goes, but it will always then contend with how much information to give. That's its thing that it's trying to do, is go, okay, but then what is the content that I should be giving? So the context is mastered, the content is always going to be a struggle. Whereas on the other side, TI, or introverted thinking, or accuracy, that has the context always being a big mystery, but the content, it doesn't. It understands that one must be responsible with information. And so the higher up in the stack it goes, the more it realizes that I don't have a complete picture. I need to get more information to understand this in a better sense. It also understands what information people need in order to have the right impression made. That is, if I'm going to actually transfer thoughts in my head into another person's head, it needs to be heard in a certain way. It needs to be understood in a certain way. it needs certain parameters inside that mind to be ready for that information. And it needs to be said in a certain way in order to land. And so the higher up introverted thinking or accuracy goes, the more it really understands how to play with information and content in order to land the plane the best way. And it won't struggle necessarily with information. In fact, it's rare when somebody uses introverted thinking or accuracy when they will give personal information that is not theirs, that is a third party's. It is rare when they are sloppy with that data. Like, they understand personal privacy. They understand privacy of information and thought and content as a general rule. If somebody is using this function as a strength but is not showing that level of discretion, it means that they usually need to do a lot more development of that function. But for the most part, they understand the importance of that level of content discretion.
I think there's a little bit of a nuance here with introverted thinking. I can imagine someone listening right now that has an introverted thinking person in their life that doesn't feel like they wouldn't share that information with a third party. And I think the nuance is that if the TP believes that that information is also theirs, like say there's an intimate moment between two people, like I mentioned, the ITP who's blasting out, like I see maybe on social media, they're blasting out elements of their relationship, like an intimate moment to the world. It's not that they're sharing information that's a third party's that's private to them. It's they kind of feel like that's their information to share, but they don't understand the context that that's also somebody else's information that they may not be able to share. So that's just a little bit of a nuance there, I think, that, because I'm sure someone listening might push back and say, wait, I have a TP in my life that overshares stuff that happens between me and them that doesn't make me feel comfortable. And I think that's where that's coming from, is the TP isn't trying to break trust. It's that they feel they own that information too.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you and I have a story about a moment that you and I had.
Yeah, and I'm like, hey, please don't share that, because it's like intimate between us,
right?
An
intimate moment that ended up being really funny. And I have shared that with other people, actually usually in the service of extroverted feeling or harmony, because it's a funny story.
Sure.
Right? And I'm like vibing with the person. And of course, that's my auxiliary function. I think people who have it as a driver or dominant are far less likely to do that. But yes, if you feel like it's your information, you have a right to share it. But I'm actually more talking about a third party's information.
Yeah, private information from somebody else.
Yes,
I understand.
Somebody else told you a secret, and the higher up that function is in the stack, unless the person is really jacked up, then oftentimes they'll become a vault for that information.
And that's also important to say here is we're talking about these as healthy people who are fairly mature, average maturity levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, not every EFJ out there is like beautifully discreet with how they keep energetic vibe going or knows how to meet needs. But the function itself, if it is healthy and well developed in a healthy and developed person, this is how it shows up for sure. There's always an exception to a rule. always, always, always. That's why we talk about them in a disembodied way. This is not reality. This is the pattern. So going to extroverted thinking, as we talked about it as the 3-year-old or inferior function for IFPs, and we talked a little bit about what it looks like as a tertiary or 10-year-old for EFPs. And we did talk a little bit about what it looks like when it's a co-pilot or auxiliary, the idea that people who have it as a strength are more discreet about what they say yes to and how much resource gets apportioned. But I also think that there's a sense of knowing what can be accomplished in what amount of time, how much needs to go into it to make it happen. I've noticed that people who have extroverted thinking or effectiveness as a strength usually have a lot more respect for things like businesses or engineering because they understand what goes into making something happen. Whenever anybody really starts to criticize businesses or criticize, something that is made, even institutions that might have fallen for some corruption, I think it's very easy to undervalue what goes into something like that, to replicate it and make a new version of it. This whole damn the man, bring down the system, there's a lot of idealism that's associated with that because nobody really talks about what it would take to make a new version of it. And so I think the higher up it goes in the stack, the more discretion there is around what needs to be taken down within that and what needs to be kept in order to keep the structure going so things don't turn into complete and total anarchy. And there's less idealism associated with extroverted thinking or effectiveness. That's one of its superpowers, by the way, is the fact that it isn't generally idealistic. It's usually very realistic about what it takes to make something happen and build something, and has deep respect for the things that have been built.
I think the alternative to extroverted thinking with the introverted feeling in the front seat, driver, co-pilot, dominant auxiliary, this idea of role-person merger, there's a sense of that still being there to some degree, but there's multiple roles, and it's not just one role you merge. You have a sense of being able to play multiple roles, and your identity is the consistent. The roles change themselves. The identity is the constant. And where I think you fit the roles to you, whereas in the backseat you fit yourself to the role, would be the differential there. When it's done well in the compulsion that's in the front seat, that's typically what I see from the introverted feeling side.
Yeah, I think also there's this sense of taking in vast territory internally means that people who have introverted feeling or authenticity are more aware of the darkness that they carry with them. So there's a lot less likely, they're less likely to accidentally bring toxic elements of who they are into the things that they're making, because they've got their finger on the pulse of the dark parts of who they are. They're taking in that territory, and they're showing discretion about what parts of themselves that they will allow to get infused in the things that they're building, making, creating, or involved in. And they know what rules can be broken and when. You're making art, and there's the rule of never showing up dark, grim, violent, or toxic doesn't necessarily apply to all forms of art, because art is part of how we, it's the cathartic element of humanity that allows us to contend with those pieces of who we are. So this idea of never bring toxicity out, that rule gets broken all the time in art and expression, and it needs to be. And so there's a sense of discretion on what elements of ourselves can we bring out and show to the world through those forms of expression, that people who have introverted feeling or authenticity higher up in their stack understand that. They understand that interplay.
One thing I like to always help focus this back on is, why does this matter? Why are we even talking about this right now? This idea of a compulsion, things showing up, regardless of where they are in your stack or your car model, there's a sense of practicality to this that I like to bring forward. So from my standpoint, one of the things this obviously does is it allows us to be aware of the ways in which we are compelled to have all parts of us show up. It's easy to maybe look at an ITP. We started talking about ITPs at the very beginning, and almost forget they have extroverted feeling in their cognitive function stack or their car model. Of course, that's going to drive. I remember hanging out with an ISTP friend of ours. I was in some emotional state. I was sharing some things emotionally one day with you in front of her. We were just talking, and I was sharing some of my emotions, and she started bawling, crying, and I was like, what is going on? And I forgot that she was picking up the emotions I was sharing. And I'm like, this is an ITP. Why is she acting like an EFJ right now? She was the empathy or the connection point, the feelings I was triggering in her 3-year-old baby extroverted feeling or harmony process was very real. And she's a close friend of ours, so she's tied into us. Maybe if it was a stranger, she wouldn't do that. And she felt the feelings that I was putting out, which weren't negative, they were just intense. I was feeling strongly about something. And I was very surprised how that caused her to cry. It really took me back. And I remember oh yeah, that's right. She has that. She's got a compulsion to use it. It's going to show up for her. It's something that is accessible, but we have a tendency to think people that have that lower down, especially in that 3-year-old or inferior, oh, they don't need that. They don't even think about it. It's nothing on their radar at all. And that's just not the case ever.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I even wanted to talk, or we wanted to talk about this, is that they're not just parts of who we are. They're parts that have desires. There's the compulsion for an ITP when it comes to extroverted feeling or harmony is actually relationship. The compulsion for IFPs with extroverted thinking or effectiveness as a 3-year-old is to make impact and make something happen that they can show for who they are, to leave an imprint. For EFJs, The compulsion is to speak truth and have intellectual integrity.
Be a teacher.
Right, to be a teacher. And the compulsion for ETJs, with introverted feeling or authenticity as their 3-year-old, is to have expression and to honor who they are, to honor the self and to understand the self. It's just that they're not as rewarded for that activity as they are for functions that are higher up in their stack. They're much more rewarded for whatever is their driver or dominant. And so they're mentally programmed with all these reward centers telling them to favor the other side. And so they do. We do, right? We favor the side that's going to give us higher reward. But there's still that part of us that begs for it, that wants the other piece, the missing piece of the puzzle, the other side of the polarity, the tail of the comet. There's a part of us that wants that so badly. And so it shows up. And it shows up clumsy if we don't understand what the ultimate desire wrapped within that function is. And of course, the higher it is on the stack, the more we have not just a compulsion, but a reward for it. And so we take in more territory, we get more sophisticated with it, we have higher discretion, and we bring it out as a gift to the world. But remembering that that compulsion exists on the other side, it's just we lack the sophistication and the discretion and the maturity and the territory. We lack all of that, and so we show up, and those don't feel like our gifts, but that's why they become our aspirations. So really kind of understanding this principle, number one, helps us realize why we're showing up the way we're showing up sometimes. It helps us cut ourselves and other people some slack if they're doing the thing that they don't do well. If they do it badly, we can cut them some slack for doing it badly because we're cutting ourselves slack for doing it badly. But then it also helps us in our integration process to really get into what is it that I ultimately desire? What is it that I'm trying to accomplish? And when I'm doing it badly, can I do it better? Is there a way where I can integrate this part of who I am and get the desires and needs represented in those functions met, but maybe go about it in a slightly different way that's more suited to how my strengths show up in the world?
Yeah. And it kind of dovetails into what we talked about last time, where it was that type dynamic, that growth, where you're not just growing your co-pilot, you're growing your whole self. And these things to be aware of can help with that personal growth element. Again, if you're new and you've been listening, you're like, what in the world are they talking about? You can go over to personalityhacker.com and look up the CAR model. And we've got tons of resources and previous podcasts talking about some of the fundamentals of personality type on a more basic level. If this is a more advanced thing for you, if you're a little lost today, don't worry. It's okay. We got you covered. Head over to Personality Hacker and check out some of that stuff. You can also come to our website and leave a comment, ask a question, or share your story directly below this podcast. We'd love to hear from you. So come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
Next week, we'll talk about the perceiving functions and how they show up as compulsions, but in varying degrees of sophistication. And so in order to be pinged to let you know that podcast is coming out, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. I just read recently that rating and reviews are a major part of the algorithm of how highly they rate our podcast on their ratings charts. So ratings and reviews are super, super, super helpful. And if you like us and our content and want to learn more and want to be able to have it in a book form, our book is out. It's called Personality Hacker. It's available at all major retailers, I believe. It's on Amazon. And if you like it and if you read it and like it, leaving us a rating review on Amazon or Goodreads also helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.